Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, January 20th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. More aid for Ukraine. The U.S. announces a new $2.5 billion weapons package. So this was announced on Thursday, and this includes the Stryker armored combat vehicles for the first time. This is the first time the U.S. is giving them to Ukraine. So it represents, another escalation of military aid. And the package includes 90 of the Strikers as well as 55 of the Bradley fighting vehicles, which the U.S. first pledged to send Ukraine earlier this month as part of an over $3 billion weapons package. So that was just a few weeks ago. In 1 month alone, the U.S. is sending $5.5 billion worth of weapons to Ukraine. I mean, it's just a huge amount of military equipment. So that 55 Bradleys, the last package was 50, so already over 100 of these Bradley fighting vehicles. And there's other things in this package that I'll read the list that the Pentagon put out. But just the Strikers, they're made by General Dynamics. They are designed to transport troops with extra protection. They're similar to the Bradleys, although they are lighter and they can hold more troops. They have a smaller gun than the Bradleys do, I believe, and they're on wheels as opposed to the Bradleys are on tracks. The Bradleys look more like tanks. So both vehicles, they're designed to carry troops, but they can also be used as offensive combat vehicles, and that's what the U.S. has in mind for this transfer, according to U.S. officials that spoke with the Washington Post. Germany and France have also pledged to send similar armored vehicles. And more about the tanks. So far, the UK said that it would send 14 of its main battle tanks. So those are the heavy tanks with the big guns that you think of when you hear the word tank. But still, we haven't seen any other countries saying for sure that they're going to send big tanks like that. And so that's kind of Ukraine is receiving a lot of new armor from these Western countries. But Valery Zaluzhny, he's the commander of the Ukrainian armed forces. The numbers that he said they need are pretty big. He said they need at least 300 tanks, 600 to 700 fighting vehicles if they're to stand a chance to drive Russia out of the territory it's captured. But again, I mean, this is just huge money, and this seems to be kind of a new thing because earlier in the war, I remember when they announced a $1 billion weapons package, and that was the biggest one yet. And now we saw one over $3 billion, now $2.5 billion, just in a matter of weeks. I mean, it really shows how they're ramping things up. And I'm just going to read. This is the long list that the Pentagon put out that this new package includes. So it includes ammunition for the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems, which is a pretty advanced air defense system the U.S. started sending Ukraine a few months back. I believe it's what protects the White House and other buildings in Washington, D.C. Also, the mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles. Those are MRAPs, they're called. 8 Avenger air defense systems, which I don't know much about. So 90 Strikers. 300 high mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicles, 20,155 millimeter artillery rounds, approximately 600 precision guided 155 millimeter artillery rounds, 95,105 millimeter artillery rounds, approximately 11,800 120 millimeter mortar rounds, additional ammunition for the HIMARS rocket systems, 12 ammunition support vehicles, 6 command post vehicles, 22 tactical vehicles to tow weapons, high-speed anti-radiation missiles, the HARMS, approximately 2,000 anti-armor rockets, over 3 million rounds of small arms ammunition, demolition equipment for obstacle clearing, Claymore anti-personnel mines, night vision goggles, spare parts, and other field equipment. So it's an important point is that all these weapons packages that we see, they're still being pulled from the funds that the U.S. has already authorized. A lot of times people think this is adding to that big number, which right now at this point Congress has authorized about $113 billion for spending on this war. And if they keep things up at this rate, I mean, they're going to be asking for more, come the spring. Several other NATO members pledged more military aid for Ukraine as on Thursday, defense ministers from NATO countries met in Brussels. The UK said it's going to send 600 of their Brimstone missiles, and Poland said that it would provide S-600 anti-aircraft guns with 70,000 rounds of ammunition. So just a lot of weapons headed there. All right, the next one. So I hope this isn't too, redundant, or we're not getting too much into the weeds on this story, but it's more about the tanks. Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, was in Berlin on Thursday, pushing the German government to sign off on the delivery of tanks. So Austin met with his new German counterpart in Berlin. As things stand right now, Poland and Finland, and I believe a few other countries now, say that they're ready to send their German made Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. But the delivery requires Berlin's approval. Now, the vice German chancellor said they would sign off on it, but Scholz, the chancellor who's in charge, has not said he's going to sign off on it. He seems pretty hesitant to do so. He said he would only do it if the U.S. sends its M1 Abrams tanks, but the Pentagon said this week that that's not happening yet. So that could be another escalation that we might see soon. However, Germany's new defense minister, Boris Pistorius, he said that he was not aware of any such stipulation when he was asked about Scholz saying, we'll only sign off on the delivery if the U.S. sends their own tanks. So who knows what's going to happen? Friday, is when we're going to see what the announcement. So I think we should expect a final decision by Friday. And the U.S. justification, they're pushing Germany to send the Leopards, but they're not going to send their own tanks. They're saying it's because multiple countries in Europe have fleets of these German-made tanks, and it makes spare parts more available. They say the maintenance with the Abrams is very difficult. So, and part of Austin's visit to Berlin was to press them to send these tanks. So, and this is the new German defense minister. He was just sworn in on Thursday, so he's dealing, thrown right into it, dealing with this issue. And again, the decision should be made Friday. Austin is chairing the Ukraine Defense Contact Group at the Ramstein Air Base in Germany, and so we might even see more pledges for military aid then. So we'll see. And again, Scholz, has explained himself, saying he doesn't want to send the tanks because he wants to avoid a direct clash between Russia and NATO, but the U.S. doesn't seem to have that concern anymore. All right, the next article here, this is actually from the Washington Post. The CIA director, William Burns, he holds a secret meeting with Zelensky on Russia's next steps. So William J. Burns traveled in secret to Ukraine's capital at the end of last week to brief Zelensky on his expectations for what Russia is planning militarily in the coming weeks and months. And this is according to U.S. officials, speaking anonymously to the Washington Post. So what I thought was interesting about this, so that it seems like, there's not many details about what they discussed. They're saying Burns went over there to say what U.S. intelligence thought, was going down with Russia's, war plans. I thought it was interesting. They said that Zelensky and his aides, they like Burns, and part of the reason that they like Burns is because he doesn't think they should negotiate with Russia. He's a respected figure among Zelensky's inner circle. They're saying he gave an accurate warning about Russia trying to capture the Antonov airport in the opening stages of their invasion. I'm not sure where that is. But also Burns' skeptical view of Russia's willingness to negotiate also has endeared him to Zelensky's aides, who have bristled at suggestions Ukraine should consider talking to the Russians to end the conflict. So I thought that was interesting. And Burns used to be uh, the ambassador to Russia, and he warned in 2008 in a cable to Condoleezza Rice that that was the year that they gave Georgia and Ukraine. They promised them, one day you'll be a NATO member, and he warned in a cable to Condoleezza Rice that it's the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite bringing Ukraine into NATO. So what was interesting is the Washington Post actually mentioned that cable. Well, they didn't mention that it was released by WikiLeaks, and they didn't say it was a cable exactly, but they did put in a quote from it. This is what they put in. I'll just read it. Quote, Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine in NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests. End quote. So I just thought that it was interesting that they included that, because usually, that's a pretty revealing cable. It shows that the U.S. knew what they were trying to do was very provocative, and it's usually missing from the mainstream. So this is part of the reason why I just wanted to run this Washington Post article. But again, they don't mention WikiLeaks because they don't care about WikiLeaks, and they don't care that Julian Assange is, still in prison, awaiting the decision on the appeal for his extradition, being tortured in Belmarsh. All right. So I'm just going to take this moment to mention again, it's our fundraiser at antiwar.com. And right now, thanks to a few of our generous donors, we have $25,000 in matching funds. We try to raise $80,000 for this fundraiser. So it's a lot, but right now, if you donate, every dollar is going to be matched with these matching funds. So it's great. You could double your impact. And again, that Washington Post article that I just went over is the archived version. That's another thing that we do that I think is pretty valuable, is that we'll post important stories from websites that have paywalls like the Washington Post and the New York Times, and we know ways to get around them. Usually archive works pretty well, but sometimes that doesn't work, and we figure out other ways. So, we never put our content behind a paywall. We're never going to do that, because this information, we want to get to everybody. But because of that, this is how we have to operate. We need to have fundraisers, and we need to ask our readers for money. So please go to antiwar.com/donate to support us. Okay, so the next article here, Russia reacts to U.S. plans to help attack Crimea. So Russian officials on Thursday reacted to a report from the New York Times that said the U.S. was warming to the idea of helping Ukraine strike Crimea, despite the risk of a Russian escalation. So this is the big story I went over yesterday, the New York Times report. And when asked about the report, Ned Price, the State Department spokesman, he essentially confirmed it. He didn't say, yes, it's true, but he did not deny the contents of the report. And he said, Crimea is Ukraine. That's something that you hear the State Department repeat a lot, because the U.S. has not recognized Crimea as Russian since Russia took control of it in 2014. And Anatoly Antonov, he is Russia's ambassador in the United States. He responded to Price's comments and the report and likened the plans to terrorist attacks, and he warned of escalation. So Antonov said, quote, the State Department threw out of touch assertions that Crimea is Ukraine and that the armed forces of Ukraine can use American weapons to protect their territory is essentially pushing the Kiev regime to carry out terrorist attacks in Russia. Hearing such remarks from Washington, the criminals in Kiev will once again feel complete permissiveness. The risk of conflict escalation will only increase, end quote. So I thought that was from the Russian embassy in the U.S., their website. I thought it was interesting. They put out this press release, and it was a journalist just asking him about that report and his response. So I think it shows that, that really raised some eyebrows in Moscow. So Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, he also responded to it, and the idea of the U.S. giving Ukraine weapons that they can use to launch attacks on, on Russian soil, referring to Crimea. He said it was extremely dangerous. And The New York Times report said that the Biden administration previously avoided supporting strikes on Crimea due to the risk of escalation, but that concern of Russia resorting to nuclear weapons has waned in Washington, even though the risk clearly still exists. So Peskov said, quote, naturally, the very discussion of the acceptability of supplying Ukraine with arms which would allow strikes to be delivered on Russian soil is potentially extremely dangerous. This will mean taking the conflict to a whole new level, which certainly would not bode well in terms of global European security. End quote. So, again, the whole reasoning for the US being less concerned about a nuclear strike is the fact that Russia hasn't used weapons since. And I mean, it's just totally absurd. And Moscow has shown a willingness to massively escalate the war in response to attacks on Crimea. They didn't start bombing the infrastructure until after the truck bombing of the Kerch Bridge. Now, the truck bombing of the Kerch Bridge was just that. It was a truck bombing. A few people died and it damaged the bridge, but that's nothing compared to like a attempt at a full scale offensive. Even though right now, they would have to break through Russia's lines and push them back if they really wanted to try to take Crimea. And even the New York Times report says the Biden administration doesn't think they actually can. But if the US gives them stuff with a little longer range, or they could use the HIMARS to, attack targets kind of leaving Crimea. They also have anti-ship missiles. They have other weapons they could potentially use to strike Crimea if they really start an offensive aimed at Crimea. I mean, who knows what Russia's going to do? So it's just extremely reckless that the U.S. is even considering this. And that report said that they're discussing this with Ukrainian officials and they're going to meet them this week and war game it out. I mean, that's how involved the U.S. is. So the next one, Medvedev, the deputy of the Russian Security Council, former president, he kind of took the warning, stepped them up a little bit, and he warned that if Russia loses the war, it could go nuclear. So Medvedev wrote this on Twitter. It was also on his Telegram. He said, quote, backward political good timers in Davos reiterated to achieve peace, Russia must lose. None of them gets that a nuclear power's loss of a conventional war can lead to a nuclear one. Nuclear powers haven't been defeated in major conflicts crucial for their destiny, end quote. So what he's not directly saying Russia would use nukes if it was losing, but that's essentially what he's saying, that, if a nuclear power loses a conventional war, especially one that's so important for them, it could go nuclear. And he's referring to comments that Stoltenberg made when he's talking about the political good timers in Davos, because Stoltenberg said at the World Economic Forum, I went over some of the stuff he said yesterday, but then I saw another quote from him. He said, weapons are the way to peace. I mean, you talk about Orwellian. So that's what Medvedev was referring to. And Medvedev, he's been very hawkish throughout this war. He's kind of been the most, I don't know if hawkish is the right word, but, he's been delivering a lot of insults towards, the West and Europe, and making threats like this, more so than other Russian officials. But the Kremlin kind of backed him up and said that his comments align with Russia's military doctrine, which allows the use of nuclear weapons if Russia's existence is threatened. And I think they've made clear that if Crimea was under threat, and plenty of foreign policy experts have said this and agree with this, Russia would consider that, existential threat to the state of Russia. So this is how seriously they take it. So Peskov said, there's no contradiction. He said, read the nuclear doctrine. There's no contradiction. And Medvedev, he wasn't responding. He didn't mention the New York Times report or the plans to strike Crimea. It seemed like he was more talking about the things they were saying at Davos. But this did come the day after, that New York Times reported the U.S. might start supporting these attacks in Crimea. So things are just getting very, very, real here. And it seems like we're almost getting back to where we were in, I think it was September, when, Putin came out and said Russia would use nukes to defend its territorial integrity. And then you had Biden say, oh, we're at the highest risk of nuclear Armageddon since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And things were just seemed really tense, and then it cooled down a bit. But it seems like with all this new military aid and talk of attacking Crimea, we're right back in it. So I don't know. I just don't have much good to say about all this. But the next one, shifting over to China and Taiwan, the U.S. expands its training of Taiwan's military with the National Guard. So this is according to a report from Nikkei Asia. They said that the U.S. has expanded the training of the Taiwanese military to include a program involving the U.S. National Guard. A source told Nikkei that the training began sometime before spring 2022, so last year. And in May 2022, President Tsai Ing-wen, the Taiwanese president, announced cooperation with the National Guard. She announced this while Senator Tammy Duckworth, Democrat from Illinois, was in Taipei. So, again, this was May 2022. Tsai said, quote, "The U.S. Department of Defense is now proactively planning cooperation between the U.S. National Guard and Taiwan's defense forces," end quote. So the report said that the training already began before Tsai made the announcement during Duckworth's visit. Since the training started, the National Guard has trained Taiwanese troops in both Taiwan and inside the U.S. National Guard training overseas, it typically involves a unit from a single state. But this report said that the training in Taiwan involves units from multiple U.S. states. The only one they mentioned by name that was involved was Hawaii's National Guard. The U.S. and Taiwan rarely acknowledge their military cooperation, and a Pentagon spokesman declined to comment on the National Guard training. And again, didn't deny it or anything, just declined to comment. So back in October 2021, the Wall Street Journal reported that there was a U.S. Special Operations Unit and a contingent of Marines in Taiwan that had been training Taiwan's military for at least a year. So now, since the U.S. severed diplomatic relations with Taiwan in 1979, U.S. military trainers have gone over there. I mean, they buy a lot of U.S. weapons, but it was always an unofficial presence, an unofficial partnership. But in October 2021, she confirmed that Wall Street Journal report, and that made it the first time that a Taiwanese leader acknowledged a U.S. military presence in Taiwan since 1979. So that was significant. And the growing U.S.-Taiwan military ties, of course, they anger Beijing. The 2023 National Defense Authorization Act that Biden recently signed, it includes measures to increase U.S. and Taiwanese military cooperation even more, because remember, this National Guard training started last year. And I think I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing them, the U.S. Navy putting out press releases. Oh, we drilled with Taiwan's military today, and putting out pictures and everything. And that's really China's not going to be happy about that. So the U.S. is also encouraging Japan's military buildup, and they're planning to expand military facilities in the Philippines. And this is all with the stuff with Taiwan, part of their effort to counter China in the region. The top U.S. Marine Corps general in Japan described the efforts as setting the theater, and said that the U.S. did something similar in Ukraine starting in 2014, after the U.S.-backed coup that deposed former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, which sparked Russia taking Crimea, the war in the Donbass. It was that pivotal moment, and then that's when the U.S. and NATO started training Ukraine's military. And the U.S. in 2014, they launched a similar National Guard training program for Ukraine. Known as the Joint Multinational Training Group. It rotated through units from different states. And U.S. military officials said that in that time period, 7-8 years, 23,000 Ukrainians were trained under the program. And the U.S. withdrew its National Guard troops from Ukraine shortly before Russia's invasion. So parallels that we're seeing here between Ukraine and Taiwan. And I think Nancy Pelosi's visit, it's not at the same level. It wasn't as much of a provocation as the 2014 coup in Ukraine, but I think that kind of, in the future, when we look back on the U.S., Taiwan, and China, that visit, Nancy Pelosi going there, even though ignoring China's warnings, is going to be like a big turning point because there's just been so much since then when it comes to China's military activity around Taiwan. All right. So the last news story today, Sullivan, the national security advisor, he visited Israel. He met with Netanyahu and they discussed Saudi Arabia. So Sullivan met with Netanyahu in Jerusalem on Thursday in the first high-level visit to the country, high-level U.S. visit since the new Israeli government was sworn in. Among other topics, Netanyahu and Sullivan discussed the possibility of Israel normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia. Both Israel and the U.S. want to see Israel normalize with more Gulf Arab nations, as it did with the UAE and Bahrain under the Abraham Accords as part of a plan to build an anti-Iran alliance in the region. It's what Israel wants. It's what the U.S. wants. Publicly, the Saudis seem very reluctant to work toward normalization with Israel, but the two countries have been quietly boosting some cooperation. They drilled publicly for the first time, did military drills for the first time together. I think it was 2021. It was after the normalization with the UAE and Bahrain. It was U.S.-led military drills that both Israel and the Saudis and also Oman participated in. I think Oman. Netanyahu called for the U.S. to mend its relations with Saudi Arabia after the Biden administration publicly feuded with the kingdom over the OPEC Plus oil production cuts that were announced in October. But the Wall Street Journal recently reported that they dropped the threats. That the Biden administration, they said there's going to be consequences for the OPEC oil cuts, but they've gotten past it now. They worked it all out, and the relations between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are starting to improve again as they're stepping up more military cooperation against Iran. Iran was another topic of conversation between Sullivan and Netanyahu, and Sullivan met with Israel's new defense minister, the head of the Mossad spy agency, he's the same. He's not new right yet. I don't know if Netanyahu's going to replace him. The head of Israel's military and his new counterpart, the new Israeli national security advisor. And the meeting came amid concern over the new government's plans to expand settlements in the West Bank and overhaul Israel's judiciary system, which includes a plan to allow the Knesset to override Israel's top court. U.S. officials said they told Axios that Sullivan raised both issues in a private meeting with Netanyahu. All right, that's it for the news for today. The Viewpoints, go check them out. We have one from Ted Galen Carpenter. Why Can't America Accept an Imperfect World? Nan Levinson, Give Peace a Chance. Ramsey Baroud, It Has Always Been a Religious War. William Batscheider, The Sorrows of Empire. That's actually a review of Scott Horton's book, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And then our spotlight is really good. It's from Ben Cohen, one of the co-founders of Ben & Jerry's over at Salon. Killing the Messenger, Joe Biden's Disturbing Hypocrisy on Julian Assange. He's really good on the issue. He was at that rally for Assange that I was at in this past November in D.C., and he spoke. But that's it. That's everything. I almost thought I wasn't going to make it through there for a second, so I'm a little out of it today. But that's it for the week. I'll be back after the weekend to keep you updated and everything. Again, go to antiwar.com/donate to support us. Help us get through this fundraiser. That's the most important thing for us right now. But I'll be back after the weekend. I hope everybody has a good one. Thanks for listening.